Before we talk about freedom, we need to confront a possibility that most people never consider. What if freedom is not the opposite of fear? What if freedom is one of its deepest sources? That sounds backwards. We grow up believing that fear comes from restriction, from rules, from authority, from being trapped inside a cage built by someone else. And because of that, we imagine freedom as the final reward, the solution, the destination. But if that were true, why do so many people become more anxious after gaining more freedom? Why does the person who finally leaves the job feel lost? Why does the person who escapes expectations suddenly struggle with purpose? Why does unlimited choice so often create paralysis instead of peace? These questions are not modern questions. They are human questions. And hidden inside one of the most famous archetypes in Journey to the West is a disturbing possibility: the greatest burden is not being controlled by someone else. The greatest burden is becoming responsible for yourself. This is where most people misunderstand the Monkey King. Not because they misunderstand a character, because they misunderstand what he represents. In the symbolic language of spiritual psychology, Wukong is not merely a hero, a rebel, or a mythological figure. He is an archetype. He represents the part of the human mind that refuses limitation. The part that wants absolute autonomy. The part that says, "No one will tell me who I am." At first glance, that sounds powerful. In modern culture, it sounds almost heroic. Be yourself. Break the rules. Reject authority. Live on your own terms. But there is a hidden question buried beneath all of those slogans. What happens after the chains are gone? Because that is where the real challenge begins. Imagine an empty throne. Not a king sitting on it. Not a ruler controlling it. Just an empty throne. A symbol of total freedom. Most people look at that image and feel excitement. But look closer. An empty throne also means there is nobody left to blame. Nobody left to obey. Nobody left to follow. Nobody left to define who you are. And suddenly the throne doesn't feel liberating. It feels heavy. This is the first paradox. The cage may disappear, but the fear remains. That is why freedom creates a unique kind of anxiety. Restriction gives us something to push against. Something to resist. Something to explain our failures. Freedom removes those excuses. And when excuses disappear, identity is exposed. Who are you when nobody controls you? Who are you when every decision belongs to you? Who are you when every consequence belongs to you? Most people spend years dreaming about freedom. Far fewer spend years preparing for it. That pattern appears everywhere today. We see it in careers. People escape structures they dislike, only to discover that self-direction is harder than they imagined. We see it in relationships. People seek independence, yet feel isolated when they finally have it. We see it online. We have more freedom of expression, more freedom of choice, more freedom of identity than any generation before us. Yet rates of anxiety, confusion, and uncertainty continue to rise. Why? Because freedom expands possibility. But it also expands responsibility. And responsibility is much heavier than most people expect. This leads us to a second image. A mirror with no reflection. No enemy. No authority. No system to rebel against. Just yourself. For many people, that mirror is more frightening than any prison. Because prisons tell you what to do. Freedom asks who you are. And those are not the same question. This is why the deeper reading of the Monkey King is not about rebellion. It is about what happens after rebellion. Not the breaking of limits, but the burden that appears once the limits are gone. And if that burden is real, then an even larger mystery begins to emerge. What if the true challenge of freedom is not escaping external authority at all? What if the real challenge is learning how to create an authority within yourself? If freedom demands responsibility, then a deeper question immediately appears. Why do human beings so often resist responsibility, even when they claim to want freedom? At first, the answer seems obvious. Responsibility is difficult. It requires effort, sacrifice, and discipline. But that explanation only scratches the surface. The deeper issue is psychological. Responsibility does something that many people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. It forces a confrontation with reality. As long as there is an authority above us, a system around us, or an obstacle in front of us, part of our identity remains protected. We can point outward. We can explain our frustrations through circumstances. We can tell ourselves that our potential remains hidden because something else is standing in the way. But remove the obstacle, and something unsettling happens. The spotlight turns inward. Suddenly, the question is no longer, what is stopping me? The question becomes, what am I going to do now? That shift may sound small, but it changes everything. This is why the archetype of the rebel is far more complicated than most people realize. The rebel appears to be fighting authority. Yet beneath that struggle lies another conflict entirely. The rebel is often fighting uncertainty. Because the moment external authority disappears, internal authority must be born. And that transformation is neither automatic nor comfortable. Imagine standing before an endless road. No walls. No gates. No restrictions. Just horizon after horizon stretching beyond sight. Most people call that freedom. But there is another way to see it. What if the endless road is also a burden? What if every mile represents another decision, another responsibility, another consequence that no one else can carry for you? This is the paradox hidden inside the archetype. The infinite road looks liberating from a distance. Up close, it can feel overwhelming. And this paradox is not limited to individuals. It appears in entire societies. The more options people have, the harder choices often become. The more identities become available, the more confusion can emerge about who we really are. The more freedom expands, the more people search for systems, ideologies, communities, and structures that can tell them what to do. Why? Because human beings do not merely seek freedom. They also seek orientation. This is where the symbolic layer becomes deeper. In spiritual psychology, freedom is not simply the absence of chains. Freedom is the capacity to act wisely without chains. Those are very different things. One is external. The other is internal. And many people achieve the first while never reaching the second. That distinction points toward a profound Buddhist insight. The greatest prison may not be outside us at all. It may be the mind that cannot govern its own desires. Think about that carefully. If a person is controlled by fear, anger, pride, approval, status, or impulse, are they truly free simply because nobody is giving them orders? Or have they merely exchanged one master for another? This is where another memory fragment emerges. The invisible crown. Most people imagine a crown as a symbol of power over others. But the invisible crown represents something else entirely. Power over oneself. And strangely enough, that crown is heavier than any external rule. Because it cannot be delegated. It cannot be escaped. It cannot be blamed on anyone else. The responsibility remains. The consequence remains. The choice remains. This leads to a psychological reversal that many people never see coming. Perhaps the opposite of freedom is not control. Perhaps the opposite of freedom is compulsion. The inability to govern one's own mind. The inability to choose consciously. The inability to stand alone without becoming lost. And if that is true, then another symbol begins to take shape. The empty throne. Earlier, it appeared as a symbol of liberation. A seat with no ruler. No authority. No master. But now the image changes. Because an empty throne is not the end of the journey. It is a question. Who deserves to sit there? The ego? Impulse? Fear? Desire? or something deeper? And that question reveals a contradiction at the heart of human nature. Many people want freedom from authority. Far fewer are prepared for the possibility that freedom ultimately requires becoming an authority unto themselves. But if self-mastery is the hidden requirement of freedom, then an even greater mystery emerges. Why do so many people mistake the voice of their ego for the voice of their true self? Before we can answer why the ego is so often mistaken for the true self, we have to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if the ego does not oppose freedom? What if it feeds on it? This is where the conflict becomes far more dangerous than it first appeared. Most people imagine the ego as arrogance, pride, or self-importance. But in spiritual psychology, the ego is something much more subtle. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we are. It is the identity that wants certainty. The identity that wants to feel special. The identity that wants control over reality. And that creates a contradiction. Because reality cannot be controlled. Only manipulated, delayed, interpreted, or resisted. Never fully controlled. Yet the ego keeps trying. The result is a hidden cycle that appears throughout human history, modern society, and individual lives. First, the ego encounters a limitation. Then it rebels against the limitation. Then it achieves greater freedom. Then it discovers that freedom did not solve the deeper problem. So it searches for another limitation to fight. Another enemy. Another obstacle. Another system. Another villain. The cycle repeats. Not because the world keeps creating prisons, but because the ego keeps needing them. Think about that carefully. What if some people are not addicted to freedom? What if they are addicted to rebellion? Those are not the same thing. A person can become so attached to resisting authority that authority becomes necessary for their identity. Without something to fight against, they no longer know who they are. This is the deeper shadow hidden within the rebel archetype. The rebel appears independent. But psychologically, the rebel may remain dependent on the very thing being resisted. And that changes everything. Because now the conflict is no longer between freedom and control. It becomes a conflict between identity and reality. This is where another memory fragment emerges. The broken cage. Most people see a broken cage and imagine victory. But what happens if the bird refuses to fly? What happens if the cage has become part of its identity? Suddenly the cage is not merely a prison. It is a source of meaning. Destroying it creates liberation. But it also creates disorientation. And human beings do not fear suffering as much as they fear meaninglessness. That psychological truth scales far beyond individuals. Entire groups can become attached to opposition. Entire political movements. Entire cultures. Entire civilizations. Sometimes a society defines itself through what it rejects rather than what it creates. And when that happens, conflict becomes self-perpetuating. Because ending the conflict would require redefining identity itself. This is why the problem hidden inside the Monkey King archetype is not merely personal. It is civilizational. The same force that drives innovation can also drive chaos. The same force that challenges outdated systems can also become incapable of building new ones. The same desire that liberates can eventually destabilize. Freedom without wisdom becomes fragmentation. Freedom without responsibility becomes confusion. Freedom without purpose becomes exhaustion. And this is where Buddhist philosophy introduces a startling reversal. The problem is not desire alone. The problem is attachment. Including attachment to freedom. That sounds paradoxical because freedom feels inherently good. But from a spiritual perspective, anything can become a chain if identity becomes attached to it. Power can become a chain. Success can become a chain. Recognition can become a chain. Even freedom can become a chain. The moment the ego says, "I must always be unrestricted," a new prison has already been created. Only now the bars are invisible. This brings us to another memory fragment. The invisible crown. Earlier, it appeared as a symbol of self-mastery. Now another layer becomes visible. Many people place the crown upon their own heads before they are ready to carry its weight. They claim sovereignty over themselves. Yet they remain ruled by impulse. Ruled by emotion. Ruled by validation. Ruled by fear. The crown is present. The ruler is absent. And that absence creates consequences that spread outward. From the individual to the family. From the family to institutions. From institutions to society. From society to civilization. Because every external crisis begins as an internal crisis repeated at scale. And this reveals a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the greatest threat to freedom is not oppression. Perhaps the greatest threat to freedom is the undisciplined self. But if that is true, then an even deeper contradiction begins to emerge. Why does genuine self-discipline so often feel restrictive at first, yet eventually produce more freedom than rebellion ever could? Here is the revelation hidden beneath the contradiction. Self-discipline does not feel restrictive because it limits freedom. It feels restrictive because it exposes illusion. That is a very different thing. Most people assume that the opposite of freedom is structure. But from a deeper psychological perspective, structure often serves a different purpose. It reveals the difference between what we want in a moment and what we truly value over a lifetime. And that distinction changes how we understand the Monkey King archetype. The deeper role of this archetype is not to represent rebellion. It is to represent the stage of consciousness that mistakes unlimited possibility for wisdom. At first, unlimited possibility feels powerful. It feels expansive. It feels like standing before a horizon with no boundaries. Yet hidden inside that experience is a problem that modern culture rarely discusses. Possibility alone cannot provide direction. Choice alone cannot provide meaning. Freedom alone cannot provide purpose. A person can have 1,000 open doors and still not know which one to walk through. This is why so many people feel exhausted despite having more options than any generation before them. The crisis is not a lack of opportunity. The crisis is a lack of orientation. And that leads us to a deeper symbolic layer. Consider another image. A compass spinning endlessly. Not broken. Not damaged. Simply unable to settle. The spinning compass is a powerful symbol of the modern mind. Information increases. Opportunities increase. Freedom increases. Yet clarity does not necessarily increase. In many cases, confusion increases alongside them. Why? Because orientation comes from an inner center, not from external abundance. This is where the spiritual function of the archetype begins to emerge. The undisciplined self seeks expansion. The awakened self seeks alignment. Those sound similar, but they lead to entirely different destinations. Expansion asks, how much more can I have? Alignment asks, what is actually worth pursuing? One seeks quantity. The other seeks truth. And here the shadow function becomes visible in a way that many people miss. The shadow does not always appear as weakness. Sometimes it appears as strength without direction. Sometimes it appears as intelligence without wisdom. Sometimes it appears as freedom without purpose. That is why the rebel archetype can become trapped by its own success. The more barriers it removes, the more it must confront itself. The more freedom it gains, the less it can blame the world. The more power it acquires, the more responsibility it inherits. This is not merely a personal challenge. It is a civilizational pattern. Entire societies often believe that progress means removing limits. And in many cases, that is true. Some limits should be challenged. Some systems should evolve. But every civilization eventually discovers the same truth. Removing limits and creating meaning are not the same task. One is destruction. The other is creation. And creation requires something rebellion alone cannot provide. It requires order. Not imposed order. Chosen order. This distinction is crucial. Because the hidden meaning is not that authority is always good. Nor is it that freedom is dangerous. The hidden meaning is that every lasting form of freedom depends on a deeper principle that sustains it. Without that principle, freedom begins to consume itself. This is why another memory fragment emerges. The infinite road. Earlier, it appeared as a symbol of endless possibility. Now a new layer becomes visible. An infinite road without a destination is not liberation. It is wandering. The problem is not that the road is too long. The problem is that the traveler no longer knows what the journey is for. And perhaps that is the spiritual crisis hidden beneath much of modern life. People know what they want to escape. They do not know what they want to serve. People know what they reject. They do not know what they are willing to dedicate themselves to. The result is a culture filled with movement but hungry for meaning. Filled with expression but searching for identity. Filled with options but struggling to find purpose. This brings us to another memory fragment. The mirror with no reflection. At first, it seemed to symbolize the absence of enemies and external authority. But now it reveals something deeper. The mirror has no reflection because the self being searched for has not yet been discovered. The seeker keeps looking for identity in freedom, achievement, recognition, and independence. Yet the thing being sought may exist at a deeper level entirely. And this leads to a revelation that changes the entire framework. Perhaps the central problem was never whether freedom is good or bad. Perhaps the real question is what kind of self is holding that freedom. Because the same freedom placed in different hands can produce completely different outcomes. And if that is true, then we are forced toward a much deeper mystery. What if the final challenge is not learning how to become free, but discovering who, within us, is worthy of that freedom in the first place? Here, at the deepest layer of the archetype, the question changes one final time. Not, how do I become free? Not even, how do I govern myself? But something far more fundamental. What is the self that is seeking freedom in the first place? This is the revelation hidden beneath the entire journey. The deepest conflict was never between freedom and authority. It was never between rebellion and discipline. It was never between the individual and the system. The deepest conflict exists between the false self and the true self. And most people spend their lives confusing the two. The false self is built from attachment. Attachment to identity. Attachment to status. Attachment to control. Attachment to being right. Attachment to being admired. Attachment to being unique. Attachment even to the image of being free. This is why the archetype we have been examining carries such extraordinary psychological power. Because it represents a universal human illusion. The illusion that if we acquire enough freedom, enough power, enough independence, we will finally become complete. But the illusion contains a hidden flaw. Whatever is incomplete within us travels with us. It survives every victory. It survives every achievement. It survives every escape. A person can leave the cage and still carry the cage within. That is the deeper meaning of the broken cage. The bars are gone. The conditioning remains. The prison has changed location. From the outside world to the inside world. And this is where Buddhist philosophy introduces its most radical insight. Suffering does not arise primarily from circumstances. It arises from attachment. Not because attachment is evil, but because attachment transforms temporary things into permanent demands. The mind says, I must have this. I must keep this. I must become this. I must never lose this. And the moment that happens, freedom begins to disappear. Because every attachment creates fear. Fear of loss. Fear of change. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of reality itself. This is why desire alone is not the problem. Desire can inspire growth. Desire can inspire creativity. Desire can inspire exploration. The real problem emerges when desire becomes identity. When the seeker becomes attached to the thing being sought. When freedom itself becomes an object of attachment. That is the symbolic reversal hidden inside the archetype. The seeker of freedom becomes imprisoned by freedom. The seeker of power becomes ruled by power. The seeker of identity becomes trapped inside identity. And the seeker does not notice it happening. Because the prison looks exactly like the dream. This is where another memory fragment appears. The empty throne. Earlier, it symbolized liberation. Then it symbolized responsibility. Now its deepest meaning becomes visible. The throne was never waiting for the ego. The throne was waiting for wisdom. That distinction changes everything. Because wisdom does not ask, "What can I do?" Wisdom asks, "What should I do?" Wisdom is not the expansion of possibility. Wisdom is the alignment of possibility with truth. And that alignment transforms the entire structure of human life. A person governed by attachment becomes reactive. A person governed by wisdom becomes intentional. A person governed by ego seeks domination. A person governed by wisdom seeks harmony. A person governed by illusion seeks endless expansion. A person governed by wisdom understands limits. Not as enemies, but as teachers. This insight scales upward. From individuals to families. From families to institutions. From institutions to civilizations. Many civilizations collapse not because they lack power. They collapse because power outruns wisdom. Growth outruns meaning. Freedom outruns responsibility. And when that happens, the same pattern appears at every level of reality. The outer structure becomes unstable because the inner structure was never developed. Which brings us to the deepest memory fragment of all. The invisible crown. At first, it seemed to represent self-mastery. Now its final meaning emerges. The crown does not symbolize control over others. It symbolizes liberation from the need to control. That is the transformation most people miss. The highest form of freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. It is the ability to remain free even when desire, fear, pride, and attachment attempt to rule your mind. That is why the archetype ultimately points beyond rebellion. Beyond power. Beyond identity. Beyond freedom itself. Toward awakening. And once that possibility is seen, an even larger consequence begins to emerge. If individuals, societies, and civilizations are all shaped by the level of consciousness from which they exercise freedom, then perhaps the most important question is no longer how freedom is gained. The most important question becomes what happens when freedom is placed into the hands of a consciousness that has not yet awakened to its own illusions. Once we understand that the deepest challenge is not freedom itself, but the consciousness that holds it, a new question emerges. What are the consequences of getting this wrong? Not just for an individual. For families. For societies. For entire civilizations. Because every archetype leaves a legacy. And the legacy of this archetype is far larger than most people realize. The rebel archetype does not disappear when a conflict ends. It survives. It evolves. It moves from one generation to another. It changes form while preserving its psychological core. That is why the symbolic influence of this archetype remains visible today. Not in ancient mountains. Not in mythical realms. But in boardrooms. In universities. In political movements. In social media. In the private struggles that unfold inside millions of minds every day. The consequence begins with a subtle misunderstanding. When people believe freedom alone can save them, they often neglect the inner development required to sustain that freedom. The result is not immediate collapse. The result is gradual fragmentation. Choices multiply. Direction weakens. Identity becomes unstable. Purpose becomes negotiable. And eventually, the person begins searching for something to replace the meaning that freedom alone could not provide. This is where one of the strongest memory fragments returns. The compass that never settles. A spinning compass does not indicate a lack of movement. It indicates a lack of orientation. Many people today are moving faster than ever before. Changing careers. Changing identities. Changing beliefs. Changing goals. Yet beneath all that movement lies a quieter question. Where are they actually going? This consequence expands beyond the individual. When enough people lose orientation at the same time, institutions begin to reflect the same confusion. Organizations struggle to define purpose. Communities struggle to define values. Cultures struggle to define meaning. The crisis is no longer personal. It becomes collective. And this reveals something important about human nature. People can survive hardship longer than they can survive meaninglessness. History repeatedly shows that human beings will endure extraordinary challenges if they believe those challenges serve a purpose. But when purpose disappears, even abundance can feel empty. This is why the legacy of the archetype is not ultimately about rebellion. Its legacy is about transformation. The immature form of the archetype seeks liberation from external constraints. The mature form seeks alignment with deeper truth. That transformation changes everything. The psychological function changes. The mind stops asking, "How do I avoid limits?" It begins asking, "Which limits help me become who I am meant to become?" The spiritual function changes. Discipline is no longer perceived as punishment. It becomes a pathway. Responsibility is no longer perceived as a burden. It becomes a form of participation in reality itself. And that shift creates consequences that ripple outward. A person who develops inner orientation affects every relationship, every decision, every community, every institution they touch. The influence extends beyond a single life. This is why another memory fragment becomes so powerful. The invisible crown. Not because it symbolizes authority, but because it symbolizes stewardship. The ability to carry freedom responsibly. The ability to act without becoming enslaved by impulse. The ability to hold power without becoming consumed by power. In many ways, that is the hidden legacy of the archetype. Not rebellion. Not victory. Not independence. Stewardship. The capacity to govern oneself. And when that capacity is absent, the consequences become visible everywhere. Freedom becomes polarization. Choice becomes confusion. Expression becomes noise. Power becomes excess. Progress becomes directionless. The civilization continues to move forward. Yet nobody can clearly explain where forward is. This leads to another powerful image. The empty throne. At the beginning, it appeared as a symbol of liberation. Later, it became a symbol of responsibility. Now it becomes something else. A symbol of inheritance. Every generation eventually inherits the throne. Every generation inherits freedom. Every generation inherits power. And every generation must answer the same question: who will sit there? Wisdom? Fear? Desire? Ego? Impulse? No civilization escapes that question. No individual escapes it either. And perhaps that is why the archetype continues to endure. Because it is not describing one figure. It is describing a permanent tension within human nature. A tension between what we want and what we are becoming. A tension between possibility and purpose. A tension between freedom and awakening. Yet one mystery still remains unresolved. If wisdom is what makes freedom sustainable, why do human beings repeatedly choose the immediate satisfaction of desire over the deeper freedom that wisdom offers? Here is what remains when everything else is stripped away. Not the rebel. Not the ruler. Not the system. Not even the idea of freedom itself. What remains is a question that quietly follows every human life. What are we becoming through the way we use our freedom? That question is the true legacy of the archetype. Because the deepest value of an archetype is not that it explains a character. It is that it reveals a pattern hidden inside ourselves. And this pattern has never disappeared. It appears whenever a person gains the ability to choose. It appears whenever a society gains the power to shape its future. It appears whenever a civilization stands before possibility and must decide what to do with it. That is why the symbolism continues to matter. Not because it belongs to an ancient story, but because it belongs to human nature. Every human being eventually encounters an empty throne. A moment when nobody else can decide. A moment when the responsibility becomes personal. A moment when the question is no longer, what should the world do? The question becomes, what kind of person am I becoming? And that question cannot be answered by intelligence alone. It cannot be answered by success. It cannot be answered by power. Because intelligence can justify illusion. Success can strengthen attachment. Power can magnify confusion. Without inner clarity, every gift can become another source of suffering. This may be the deepest spiritual meaning hidden beneath the entire journey. Human beings often believe awakening means acquiring something new. More knowledge. More control. More certainty. More freedom. But perhaps awakening is something entirely different. Perhaps awakening is seeing clearly what has been controlling us all along. The fears we protect. The identities we defend. The desires we chase. The stories we tell ourselves about who we must become before we can finally be at peace. And once those illusions become visible, something begins to change. Not because the world changes, but because our relationship with the world changes. The invisible crown becomes lighter. The empty throne becomes less frightening. The infinite road becomes less confusing. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because the need to dominate uncertainty begins to fade. This is where the archetype quietly transforms. The consciousness that once demanded absolute freedom begins to seek something deeper than freedom. The consciousness that once resisted every limit begins to recognize that some limits reveal wisdom. The consciousness that once searched endlessly outside itself begins to discover a center that was never dependent on external circumstances. And perhaps that is why this pattern continues to resonate across generations. Because it speaks to a tension that never fully disappears. Human beings are creatures of desire. Yet they long for peace. They seek individuality. Yet they long for belonging. They pursue freedom. Yet they long for meaning. The paradox is not a flaw in human nature. The paradox is human nature. From a Buddhist perspective, suffering does not arise because life contains uncertainty. Suffering arises because we demand certainty from a reality that was never designed to provide it. And when that demand softens, something unexpected becomes possible. Freedom no longer needs to be defended. Identity no longer needs to be constantly reinforced. Life no longer becomes a struggle to prove ourselves to the world. Instead, it becomes an opportunity to participate in reality with greater awareness, greater humility, and greater wisdom. That may be the final echo left behind by this archetype. Not that freedom is dangerous. Not that discipline is superior. Not that rebellion is wrong. But that none of these things are the destination. They are only stages. What ultimately matters is the consciousness moving through them. And perhaps that leaves us with the most unsettling question of all. If the greatest prison was never outside us, and the greatest freedom was never outside us either, then when we spend our lives searching for liberation, are we actually trying to escape the world, or are we trying to escape the parts of ourselves we have never truly understood?